So my name's John Busby, and I'll be your host. I study journalism, and I'm doing this class on media history, and so we're doing a podcast episode. I'm here with Dr. Darius Spieth, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
Okay, well, hello everybody. As John said, my name is Darius Spieth, and I teach art history at LSU, including the history of prints.
Yes, and I've taken that class, and it's really exciting, really fun. It's influenced me a lot, I guess. So here we are. So anyway, today...
Including this research, possibly,
Yes.
right? Yes.
There's a reason I pitched what I pitched. I can't lie. And what I pitched was, this kind of like, I guess it's a bit of a biopic on Nast, but or Thomas Nast, I should say. He is an American cartoonist, and, I feel like in media history, when you're going through, he's not a reporter, so he can slip through the cracks a little bit. He's not one of these big editors like Hearst or a Pulitzer or anything like that, But he still made a really big impact on what the American mythos kind of is. And I think that comes down to, the iconography. The modern version of Uncle Sam, he kind of came up with that, or at least made it to where, made it what it is today. And the same with the Democratic donkey. That idea had been around, but Nast was the guy who kind of associated that with the party. The Republican elephant, on the other hand, as a symbol, he more or less invented that, as far as I'm aware. And we'll get into the meaning of, the donkey and the elephant, but, those are really big deals. Originally, they were insults, but now they've been adopted by the parties themselves, which is testimony to how, big a deal they are. And finally, we have Santa Claus. He kind of adopted this idea of Santa Claus from I guess it was, his German background, or, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second, but, Coca-Cola is going to take that and run with it, but, Nast kind of popularized this idea of Santa Claus in the United States. He's known for working at Harper's Weekly, which was, an American publication. We'll talk more about that a little later. And that's where, these images of Uncle Sam, the Democratic donkey and the Republican elephant, that's where they really, pick up. That's, where I guess he kind of made history,
So maybe we'll just start it out with Harper's Weekly then.
Why not?
We just talked about it, and it's really an American, New York-based media company that took off by about 1850, and I think that's very important because that's also when consumer society becomes a little bit more like what it is today, and there was definitely a huge demand for the illustrated press, that is illustrations, images in the press, generally speaking, and all of this business starts in London with the Illustrated London News in 1842, and then L'Illustration in Paris. And the Harper brothers kind of do the same thing in New York, and they start a whole bunch of periodicals, including Harper's Weekly, of which Nast will become the centerpiece. But there's also Harper's Bazaar, which is still around, which is a survivor of this. And so basically the images are a major selling point for these weekly periodicals.
Yeah, I with this European influence, early on in Nast's career, he's actually sent to Europe. I guess his first big break is to cover a boxing match between an American and an Englishman. And then shortly after that, he's sent, to follow Garibaldi's army, as he's trying to unify Italy. And that's kind of, where his step into journalism, really happens.
And politics, too. I mean, if you're talking about Italian unification, I mean, how many people really talk about Italian unification, but you find so many squares in Italy that are being called after Garibaldi and streets, and because Nast was very much a political artist and caricaturist, I think. And if I look at a lot of his work, I think he was really very much influenced by Daumier in France. You know, Daumier Daumier worked for Le Charivari, which was again kind of the French equivalent of Harper's Weekly. And Daumier really got into trouble. He got arrested because he made a caricature of the then French King Louis Philippe, and they locked him up for a couple of days. He got out eventually, and it left him really shaken. Now, there were censorship laws in place at this point in time, but still compared to Napoleon I, it was a good deal. Napoleon I really cracked down on journalists and sent them to French Guiana, where many of them died of yellow fever. I don't know. Do you have any indication that did Nast ever got into trouble for any of his caricatures?
I mean, from what I can tell, it wasn't that much trouble. If anything, I think his caricatures are kind of, I think they kind of had the opposite effect. He ended up, we'll talk a bit about Boss Tweed, but I think that's where like this comparison comes from, how Nast like depicted the Tammany Hall political machine of New York. I mean, that's some of what he's best known for. And you know, you're both Daumier and Nast. They portray these really fat kind of, at least for Nast, it's these fat capitalists who are abusing a system. And
right. I'm looking at your illustration here from Harper's Weekly, October 21st, 1871. With this guy with this really pear-shaped face with the dollar sign. That reminds me very much of the caricatures that Daumier did of Louis Philippe. You know, I have a hard time imagining that he was not looking at that. And Daumier was really going after corruption in the political system. He loved to He used a kind of overweight politician as an archetype for political corruption, and he also, of course, loved to go after the bourgeoisie and loved to play those members of society out as essentially against the working classes. Daumier certainly had working class sympathies, there's no doubt about it. Probably one can describe him even as a socialist. Do we know anything about Nast's political convictions?
Nast was a staunch Republican. So at this point, you know, the American political parties, for one, the Republicans were really new. They were a combination of, you know, the Whigs from before as well as the Know-Nothings, which both kind of fell into, you know, obscurity, as well as a handful of other, you know, I guess, I'm not saying fringe, but, you know, movements that had clearly, you know, fizzled out. So the Republicans are kind of a coalition in this regard, and they're the, you know, abolitionists, and they, you know, are even pushing toward the right for women to vote and that sort.
So they were more progressive at that point in
yes,
time.
It was, and you know, of course, today we've kind of, you know, flipped around, but at the time, you know, the Democrats were, I think they had a bit more of like a libertarian stance overall, but they were definitely your conservative party. And, you know, looking at, you know, how that plays in with our donkey and elephant, I feel like it's only appropriate we talk about them now. Let's see, and for the example here, you know, I picked the, you know, Stranger Things Have Happened. I'm not so much talking about, you know, the meaning of what's going on here, though it's not that vague. We're looking at an elephant that's huge, and he's or she, I guess, is you know, stumbled on the ground because the weight of, you know, the Republican Party, it's too big for its own good. It's lumbering around, and even though it's strong, even though it's powerful, it's tired, and it can't get much done because of that. Now, of course, during the Civil War, your opposition's fighting against you. There's a lot of stuff you can get done, and you know, that's how we got the you know, the 14th and 15th Amendment. But anyway, staying on topic here, the donkey, which is you know, closer up front, I mean that's clearly ignorance right there. That's ignorance and stubbornness that is literally taking you know, our politician, I could be wrong, that Lincoln's vice president here, you know, taking him off a cliff essentially. So at least the Republicans are sticking there. And of course, when Lincoln gets shot, he is replaced by that compromised Democrat vice president who was notoriously against the Reconstruction of the South, at least in the way that subsequent presidents like Ulysses S. Grant might have been.
Well, I think the Civil War definitely makes Nast kind of unique in the sense that he was active during that period of time, and that provided a lot of the subjects for his art. Do we have any indication where his journal stood on that matter, the Harper's Weekly, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, Harper's Weekly was, at least by today's standard, it was pretty editorial and it was pretty pro-union. Yeah. And that reflected Nast's own beliefs. However, there were a handful of kind of quirky things about Nast, because though he was an abolitionist and he was very against the idea of slavery, he was really racist towards Irish immigrants, and it's the subject of a lot of his cartoons. And I also want to make a note right here that just because Nast is primarily known for these kind of silly and funny caricatures, he did also dabble, maybe not dabble, but he did also have more serious, realistic works.
But I think he never used it to express his sympathies with the working classes like Daumier did, I imagine.
No, definitely not. That was for more of your more modern journalism that was going on. It was still going on, the Civil War was the first time, at least in American history, that you really had correspondence. And, the technology of the time really allowed for news to be going quickly. I mean, the telegram was, really making its mark. You had, you would have people carrying out the wires to the battlefield. And you're also dealing with some of the first censorship in, the American, journalism scene.
The printmaking technique of these works is also very interesting. I have not studied Nast's printmaking techniques in detail, but this looks very much to me like wood engravings. Of course, there were two types of printmaking techniques used for the illustrated press, and this is the reason why the illustrated press took off. And I think the first thing one needs to know is that this is kind of before photographs could be cheaply mass reproduced. So we're talking here about the 1860s, 1870s here. Photography, the earliest daguerreotypes, we're really talking about very end 1820s, 1830s. And then by the 1840s, you had a positive-negative process. But that did not mean that you could print photographs in mass media. That only happened by the end of the century, and so we're still here in an age where photography is not viable for illustrations in mass media. And the two techniques that were available for mass reproducing images in media periodicals were really lithographs in the first place, and wood engravings. I think these are wood engravings. Lithographs, that was a technique by again a Bavarian, interestingly enough, a man by the name of Sennefelder, who came up with it at the very beginning of the 19th century. And it involves large so-called lithographic stones, limestones, and greasy ink and greasy pencils, and it's based on the basic law of physics that water and oil don't mix. In practical terms, what you get then is a stone from which you can print drawings. So it's very convenient that now for the first time you could directly reproduce drawings. And Daumier, of course, was a great master of lithography. But in parallel with that, you have wood engraving, which is a very hard wood that is being engraved, and you can make a drawing on that block and engrave it. It has lots of hatching, cross-hatching, like an engraving, except that an engraving is done on metal, typically copper, and now you have this very hardened, special type of wood in the 19th century that behaves a little bit like metal. And that's also cheaper. Copper, of course, is very expensive as a material, and these wood blocks are more cheaper, and that's a big factor if you need to crank out every week a new journal. And so you could make directly drawings on those. But what is so curious about wood block engravings is that some of these wood block engravings look very photographic. And I'm looking here at this dedicated to the Chicago Convention, the Compromise with the South. That looks quite photographic to me in many ways. And that's not coincidental, because some of these wood blocks, wood engraving blocks, were actually carved with a photograph glued onto the surface, and then you would carve into the block. So it's a really anachronistic technique where you use a more advanced technology to produce an image that's using an older, much more traditionalist technique, because ultimately engravings go back to the late 1400s and the early Renaissance.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think is really interesting, with my dabbling in, journalism, is just how important these images are even then. I mean, today, I wouldn't be allowed to run a story if it didn't have an accompanying image, and we're dealing with publications. We're still a little ways away from, the advent of like real photojournalism like Life magazine, but I mean...
well, these are the ancestors of the illustrated picture story, since you mentioned Life magazine,
right,
which was, of course, a staple of Life magazine. And then what did in Life magazine was really the advent of TV by the late 60s and early 70s. So, but I think this is absolutely right to draw this parallel, although we're kind of roughly 100 years and a little bit less earlier here. But these illustrated press periodicals are the precursors of Life magazine and other similar publications, Ebony, Time magazine, etc.
So I will go back in time just a little bit, to the start of the Civil War. I do want to make a note that Nast starts working at Harper's Weekly, where he really makes his mark. He becomes a staff illustrator in 1862 at around the age of 20, which is a little intimidating for me. I'm around that age, and I could not imagine working for a newspaper full time. But yeah, and so that kind of...
So what do we know actually about his education, right? I suppose he went through some kind of assistantship, right? But not a lot of schooling in the final. He went to the National Academy of Design, right? For a while, but
he spent about a year there, and he was in grade school until 14. But from what I've read anyway, it never was a natural thing for him, and I think that would be typical of
well, caricaturists generally speaking. I think also if you look at Daumier was not an academically trained artist, and although he did oil paintings that nobody knew about when he was alive, but the oil paintings he kept for himself, and he did not show them in the salon. And if he had attempted to show them, probably they would have been dismissed anyhow. So yeah.
During this time, one of the things I think is interesting, and this might just be kind of a selfish sort of interest, is just the way Lady Columbia and Uncle Sam are kind of used interchangeably, and I think the key difference is that Columbia always has a shred of dignity, and Uncle Sam is usually this kind of jingoistic. He always looks like he's about to hold up his fists and he's gonna punch you or whoever he's in front of.
But this is not. Nast is not responsible for the Uncle Sam, the poster "I want you" for the U.S. Army.
No, that would come later. Though that version of Uncle Sam is the one Nast more or less created. There's a little bit
because that's what most people probably think of today when they hear that. The mental image that comes to mind.
In all truth, I didn't know Uncle Sam was as old of like a concept as he is until I really researched this project. It's
idea of liberty resonated very strongly also then in the post-Napoleonic and romantic world.
Yeah. And speaking of military occupation, we've got Reconstruction, which, if I'm not mistaken, one of the philosophies, there were a bunch of presiding philosophies depending on who was, in charge, be it congressional versus a presidential versus the military Reconstruction. This territory as though it was occupied from another country. And in any case, Nast was generally a supporter of, all of Reconstruction. He thought, I think to a certain capacity that the South should be punished, which was a little bit of a radical thought for the time, especially when you had, at that point, so many, politicians of the attitude like, all right, we've put in our time for this Civil War. Now let's take the troops back and, go about our business, But anyway, Nast, during this time, he's going to start endorsing candidates. And generally speaking, like we said before, it's going to be Republicans almost the whole way. I think he makes an exception once, in the coming years. But, outside of these presidential figures, this is also when, his caricatures of Boss Tweed, who we mentioned earlier, and the Tammany Hall political machine, that's when they start coming up. And that's that, the fat man with a money bag, for a head. That's that image of that was Boss Tweed. It was clear even to those who really couldn't read that this guy was bad. This guy is evil. He's motivated strictly by money. So he extorts essentially $25 to $45 million in the money of the 1860s and 70s. I quickly did a Google search on what would that be worth today, and that's well over $1 billion, depending on, which year estimate you're going off of. And so, Tweed was interesting because he had been covered by the print media a reasonable amount, but because so many of his voters were more or less illiterate, he really didn't care that much. A few sources have said. But when Nast, comes out with these images, you don't have to know how to read necessarily to understand that this isn't a good guy. Mm-hmm. So originally, Tweed tries to bribe Nast with $100,000 to stop picturing him. Negotiates with Tweed up to $500,000 for the bribe, but he ultimately doesn't take it. Mm-hmm. I think he cited something like, I've in this deep and I've tried to stay true to my beliefs, so I guess I've got to stick to it. But anyway, so Tweed ends up losing his re-election and is convicted of fraud in 1873, shortly after, all of these illustrations are coming out. And he attempts to flee to Spain through Cuba. But, and this is my favorite part of the story, it's, the officials there, the Cuban officials, or I guess the Spanish Cuban officials, they recognize him because of Nast's pictures, and Tweed will ultimately die in jail, and that's his fate. Now, you could probably do an entire, one of these on Tweed himself, but I'll stick to Nast. Nast ends up leaving Harper's Weekly in 1886, which, I want to say that was around about 25 years, like I said earlier, about, how long he worked there. And a lot of historians speculate that was kind of the downfall of the publication. But Nast doesn't really have anywhere to go. He tries to start his own publication called Nast Weekly, and this fails miserably. It leaves him broke and without the options to do anything about it.
That's a very narrow market, right? Where do you go? You can go to the competition, perhaps. Most newspapers, of course, don't have any illustrations at that point in time. The New York Times is around, but you would not find any illustrations. These are only these weeklies called the Illustrated Press, and they are kind of in a different, separate category, and there are not that many periodicals around that cater to that market.
Really doesn't have a job. He's kind of penniless, but Theodore Roosevelt is an admirer of his. And so he feels sorry for Nast and appoints him consul general in Ecuador. And within a year of arriving in Ecuador, Nast catches yellow fever and dies. And for those of you who are curious, consul general is a job where it's his responsibility to make sure that Americans in Ecuador are treated fairly and right. And his legacy today, outside of, all the symbolism and iconography, there are a few, awards in journalism for cartooning that are named after Nast.
Oh. Well, it's kind of ironical. He wanted to do something good for him, and then he kills him. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that is a little ironic.
Yeah. Well, but in any case, it's an interesting story, I think, and the whole story of the illustrated press today is largely forgotten, and probably unduly so, because it's an interesting and very important element of press history and the history of printmaking and of popular culture. One can still learn a lot from these images today about the time when they were created, and also about certain things that have survived into our modern days, and where they came from originally and their original meaning.
Yeah, I mean, like it or not, images are necessary in modern journalism. Trust me, it gets in the way of a lot of breaking news stories, because you have to think oh, how am I going to find an image for this? But when it shows up on social media, you need that. And of course, they weren't thinking that at the time, but the same phenomenon of look at this pretty picture still existed. And the two have been, I'm not saying inseparable, but you need images in journalism, whether we like it or not. And I want to say this is kind of where that idea really picks up.